I'm incredibly honored to introduce to someone I think is basically a living legend, someone who's served this country for 39 years, General Mike Hayden, who has recently retired after his most recent posting as Dernza Director of NSA for the previous 6 years. And that's all I want to say. I want to let the man speak for himself. He'll give us some thoughts on how he thinks the Department of Defense is currently approaching cyber warfare. Thank you.
Well, good morning, and thanks for the opportunity to come and be with you here this morning. I've got some notes, and I may occasionally come back to the podium to refer to them, but most of what I have to say is fairly informal. Now, there are lots of ways of coming at this question of what is cyber warfare. I really wish that I could come to you and give you case studies, but those are very classified, and I'm just unable to do that. What I can do, and remain unindicted, would be to talk about how it is we're thinking about cyber war. And I think one of the themes I would want to share with you very early on is we're thinking a lot about it, but not very clearly. And a point I think I'll continue to make throughout the presentation is that we're a bit sloppy with our language. We throw the term cyber war pretty much at anything unpleasant that seems to be happening on the net. And we may get there, and we may decide that this domain is of such character that that's a comfortable categorization, but it sure isn't the categorization we have in physical space. So, if you will, let me talk a little bit about American military doctrine, how American military doctrine is thinking about cyberspace, go a bit into cyber command and how that reflects current thinking, and then I will end up with what really are a whole series of issues and questions that are fundamentally unresolved, and then I promise that I'll leave some time for questions. So let's start with the kind of the doctrinal question. How does the American Armed Forces think about this cyber thing? I got first introduced to this in 1996. At that time, I assumed command of the Air Intelligence Agency, which many of you may know. It's now going by the Air Force ISR Agency, but it's on Security Hill down in San Antonio, between Kelly and Lackland Air Force bases. I had just come from the Balkans, where I was a chief of intelligence for U.S. forces in Europe. And when you're an intel guy, you need to know your space. Right? You really need to almost have a tactile sense as to where you are. I mean, otherwise, how can you give those kinds of judgments that a commander needs to make operational decisions? So I had come from a war in the Balkans in which it was all about history. Okay? I mean, current ops were important, but what was behind the current ops was decades, if not centuries, of history that would be invisible to an American if he didn't take the extra step to understand it. So that, for example, I can recall there was fighting south of Sarajevo in a city called Mostar. Mostar is along a river called the Neretva. There was fighting. We were briefing Chuck Boyd, who was the 4-star deputy commander of European Command. We were talking about the Croats attacking the Muslims. And he said, Mike, the Croats are on the offensive. Yes, sir. The Croats are on the offensive against the Muslims. How far will they go? General, I think they're going to fight all the way to the Neretva, right to the river, and then they'll hold. And General Boyd says, so why, is that a good defensible line? I said, oh, yes, sir. The banks of that river drop down there about 20 meters, right there in the center of town. It's a wonderful defensive line, but that's not why they will go to the Neretva and stop. And he says, all right, so why? And the answer was because in the great schism of Christendom in 1056, the dividing line between Orthodoxy and Catholicism was the Neretva River. The Croats are Catholic. They think that's their land up to the river. That's as far as they'll go. So, know your context. My context in the Balkans was history, and now I get parachuted into San Antonio to the Air Intelligence Agency, and the context there is this new thing called cyber. We were all going to school on it. We were all trying to figure out what it meant. How do you think about it? How do you organize what's the template within which you can place your thoughts. And this is fairly old thinking now, but it wasn't old thinking in 1996. And frankly, a lot of the energy for it was coming out of San Antonio, where we were. And it was simply this: cyber is a domain. Okay? It's not a network. It's not a line item in your budget. It's not a program. It's not just bandwidth. It's a domain. And when a GI says domain, what he's really saying is, it's like land, sea, air, space, and now cyber. We actually found that when we began to think of cyber as a domain, it was liberating in terms of our operational and strategic thinking. Because once you identify it as a domain, you can gather up the attributes of that domain, which are: it's inherently global, it's inherently strategic, it's characterized by great speed, it's characterized by great maneuverability. I mean, these are all things that shape military thinking. So we found that to be actually a very comfortable model. We just thought of it as a domain, and given our line of work, on a good day, a domain of operations, and on a bad day, a domain of combat. And that was the framework. That's pretty much become American military doctrine now. By the way, you don't get Cybercom, the new 4-star command up at Fort Meade that's supposed to do this stuff in the cyber domain. You don't get Cybercom in American military thought until you embrace the fact that cyber is a domain. Okay? We organize, for the most part, our combat forces on the domains in which they operate. That's why we have an army for that. We have 2 armies for that one domain. We've got the Marine Corps and the Army. We've got an Air Force for the air domain, the Sea Force, and so on. So you have this domain. I left it. I left San Antonio. I went to Korea. Didn't stay up on current thinking. Came back to doctrinal thinking about warfare in the cyber domain. It was still very strongly felt it was a domain, but there were cracks that were beginning to appear in the kind of the foundation of the concept that cyber was a domain just like the other domains. This probably had been obvious to you your entire lives, but it wasn't obvious to us, and only on discovery do you go, oh, sure, of course that's true. But there's a distinction between cyber and the other 4 domains. God made 4. You made the last one. God did a better job. Because now, if you think back, now this I actually have these kinds of conversations with other groups, not nearly as knowledgeable as yours, but bear with me so you get a sense of what it is I tell even less technologically agile audiences. I say, you know how this started, right? And I walk them back in history to ARPANET. It came out of the Advanced Research Projects Agency. When the thrust of this, was to how can we connect our labs, all of whom we know and all of whom we trust. How can we connect them in a way that we can move data between and among them quickly and facilely? I mean, that was the technological and entrepreneurial spark that creates what becomes the internet, but created ARPANET. I would suggest to you that cultural framework, the nodes are known and trusted, the problem is moving data, is the cultural framework of the net today, even though the number of nodes is, as a practical matter, infinite, and almost none of them should be trusted. Again, I'm a Catholic liberal arts major. I had a science course, I think, my freshman year in college. So I have to move all these thoughts into another space in order to think about them. And so I moved the whole question of cyber domain and ARPANET and its characteristics into physical space and say something along the lines of, you guys made the cyber world look like the North German plain. And then you bitch and moan because you get invaded. We all get treated like Poland on the web. invaded from the west on even number centuries, invaded from the east on odd number centuries. Here's the point. We made it flat. We gave all advantages to the offense. The inherent geography of this domain, which we created, the inherent geography of this domain, everything plays to the offense. There is almost nothing inherent in the domain that plays to the defense. That really affects how you think about it when you're a GI. Now, in the real world, rivers, hills, mountains become a military officer's friend. They actually create boundaries. And I think over time, folks like you, far more knowledgeable about what this really comprises than I'll ever be, you're going to build rivers and hills into the web. You're going to create, I'm speaking metaphorically now, obviously, you're going to create geography, all right, that is going to help the defense. I mentioned when I finished the tour in San Antonio, I went to Korea. I served 2 tours in Korea. Think with me just for a minute about the geography of Korea. Okay? There are only 3 ways the North can invade the South. Okay? They can come down the East Coast Road, and the gap of land between the water and the mountain there is much smaller than the width of this room. There is no one coming down that road in a major armor invasion. There's another corridor called Kaesong-Munsan, which is actually on the floodplains of the Han and the Imjin rivers, which is actually a pretty good route of advance. And that was, by the way, the route that was used by the North Koreans in 1950. They came down Kaesong-Munsan, Seoul. All right. People say, well, they could use that as an invasion corridor today. No, they can't. No, they can't. Many of you have been to Seoul. It's a wonderful international city, great place to visit. It's exciting. 12 million inhabitants. You all think of it as a great urban center. People who go through life with the kinds of lenses I've had to wear know it may be a great urban center, but what it really is the largest tank trap in the world. You will not get armor through Seoul. Which leaves the third route, which is a valley called Chorwan that starts in the north, comes down in the south, and empties south of the urban sprawl that comprises Seoul. It's an ideal for an invasion. Except the valley is very wide in the north, and the further south you come, it gets narrow. And so our view and our O plan there, which is called 5027, the defense of the Republic of Korea, was we get the A-10s to the Korean Peninsula, they die in their tanks at the bottom end of the Chorwan, and we win. There are no Chorwans on the internet we have created. All advantages go to the offense. There's one other thing, too. I said how this 5th domain differs from the other 4. I'm clever enough to either remember an historical example or imagine an example in which you can confine combat in any of those domains, any of those 4, to that domain. Okay? Battle of Gettysburg, that pretty much was a ground thing, right? Not many other domains involved. Battle of the Coral Sea, pretty much a sea thing. Battle of Britain, pretty much air. Haven't done things in space, but you can imagine those circumstances. In cyber, and actually, this was something and I can't get in details of the actual events, this is something that was learned over the last several years in terms of cyber ops. You can never do anything in this domain without something going pop in one of the other 4. At the end of the day, it really isn't a video game. And something's going to happen in somebody's physical space when you do something in this 5th domain. Anyhow, so that lays the broad construct. Let me just read a few things to you here, and I'm quoting some folks, but it's based upon what I think I've just laid out for you. So, a consequence of the unique structure of cyberspace is that fundamental precepts that work in the physical world, like risk management, like detection, like monitoring, like attribution, may be less applicable in the virtual world. What I'm trying to set up for you, and the rest of my time with you this morning is going to be suggesting how hard it is to think about combat in the cyber domain, because we're in the habit of taking our experiences from the other 4 domains, the physical world, and dropping them in here, and they're not working. They're not working at all. Here's an extended quote. Now, just bear with me, but it's really valuable. It's from Martin Libicki of RAND, and he talks about deterrence. Okay? He says, the ambiguities of cyber deterrence contrast starkly with the clarity of nuclear deterrence. In the Cold War nuclear realm, the attribution of an attack was not a problem. The prospect of battle damage was clear. The 1,000th bomb could be as powerful as the first. Counterforce, that is, weapon on weapon rather than weapon on something not a weapon, counterforce was possible. There were no third parties to worry about. Private firms were not expected to defend themselves. Any hostile nuclear use crossed an acknowledged threshold. No higher levels of war existed, and both sides had a lot to lose. Well, I did 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. There are 9 characteristics that become dogmatic in the physical world with regard to deterrence, and I think I could make an argument that none of the 9 work in cyberspace. So one more quote, this one from Machiavelli. It kind of lays out the challenge we have. There is nothing more difficult to take in hand, more perilous to conduct, or more uncertain in its success than to take the lead in the introduction of new things. Welcome to Cyber Command. Let me parse this out with regard to Cyber Command. And again, this is probably very familiar to most of you, but to make sure we're all understanding what we're about here, Cyber Command conducts computer network operations. Okay, CNO in the jargon. If I had a whiteboard here, and if I was doing this for my class at George Mason, I would draw a triangle like that. Okay, and in the middle of the triangle, I would put CNO, Computer Network Ops. And then at each angle, I'd put another 3-letter label that shows the subsets of the big thing. CNO, CND, Computer Network Defense. Pretty self-explanatory. CNE, Computer Network Exploitation. CNA, Computer Network Attack. Okay? Defense, pretty clear. Exploitation. Existing on an adversary network for an extended period of time with the expressed and limited purpose of extracting information from that network. Got it? Extended period of time, somewhat stealthy, extracting information. CNE. CNA. One of those D words. Okay, that information you're extracting or reading over here you apply one of the D words to it. Delay, deny, disrupt, destroy, degrade. That's computer network attack. Okay? So that comprises the universe of CNO. Now, you know, I know, but you really know, that those 3 angles there, D, E, A, technologically and operationally, they're identical. They're all the same thing. All it means is having your way on the net and preventing other people from having their way. But fundamentally, they're the same. Except when you come into the American political system. And you find that C and D has oversight conducted by the Homeland Security Committee. CNE is watched over by the Intel committees, and CNA is watched over by the Armed Services committees. That the authority to do C&D is up here in civil law, CNE is over here in Title 50 in intelligence law, and CNA is over here in Title 10, the laws of armed conflict. That the funding stream for each of those activities, which I just told you are identical, are completely different. With the Intel funding line over here for this, the DoD funding line over here for this, and domestic funding over here for that. If you ever want an example of taking a new idea and trying to shove it into old forms, this is it. Okay? And it makes it hard. It makes it hard for us to do this efficiently. We knew this. This was not a surprise. Before there was the COCOM, before there was the Combatant Command Cyber Command, we had something called JFCCNW, Joint Functional Component Command Net Warfare. It was kind of like a baby cybercom. I was the director, and I was working for the commander of STRATCOM at the time, Jim Cartwright, who's now the vice chairman. I can remember Jim and I going down in front of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, a pretty informal session. It was literally Jim and Mike talking to the senators, saying, please don't beat us up, don't hurt us, but we're going to be moving stuff in between that C&E and CNA thing. It's not dishonest. We're not trying to hide it from you, but it's just the nature of the work. Well, that's a work in progress. Now, let's jump from this creation of the command, which has some problems here, into some of the really core issues about cyber war. The first thing is, what constitutes an attack? Remember my triangle? Okay. Defense, nah. Exploitation, attack. In American military thought, frankly, in American legal thought, an attack is when you do one of those D things. Delay, deny, disrupt, destroy, degrade somebody's information. Over here, under exploitation, where you're just sucking, the contents of the Library of Congress out of some defense industrial base every other day, we don't call that an attack. We don't call that cyber war. And I mentioned earlier about we're kind of sloppy with our language. That's C&E. That's exploitation. That's espionage. States do that all the time. CSIS did a study late winter, and they asked citizens of first world nations, and they got it was a scientific survey, and they got good numbers and had confidence in the survey. Who is the most feared nation in cyberspace? And the answer was the United States of America. Without going into any great detail, we're actually pretty good at this. And the Chinese aren't the only ones doing it. I actually, one of the fellows doing the CSIS study was talking about down here, okay? By the way, let me talk for a minute about Chinese espionage, just before I get to this point. As an intelligence professional, I stand back in absolute awe and wonderment at the Chinese espionage effort against the United States of America. It is magnificent in its breadth, in its depth, in its persistence. I think they went to school on Gulf War I, saw their deficiencies, and have frankly decided they're going to build, buy, or steal what it is they need to make that military equation more equal. And although I have no more insight than you as to who is actually conducting these attacks, I understand the general public storyline is that there appears to be a Chinese hand in it, so it could very well be part of this macro espionage effort. Anyway, the folks at CSIS asked me, what should we do about the Chinese doing all this? And it was in the sense that, we need to take some sort of retaliatory action, that we at least got to issue a démarche or something, okay? And knowing my triangle, okay, and knowing what it means, my answer was, what should we do about the Chinese doing all this? I said, you should do what my dad told me to do when I was about 9 years old in Pittsburgh. Quit whining, act like a man, and defend yourself. So the language betrays us. And I'd ask you to be careful in the future when you talk about attacks. There's another really cute thing that happens inside this domain. I mean, you can actually extrapolate this defend, exploit, attack thing. You can actually kind of look through it as a lens and kind of go back into the old physical world. Okay, bear with me here. It takes a minute, but this is actually quite interesting. this is the intel corner, exploitation, right? And this is the ops corner, attack. Okay. In the physical world, and I'm a career intel guy, so I know this. In the physical world, intel is what you do before the ops. Okay? The J2 generally gets a lot busier much earlier than the J3, because the J2 has got to go out and develop the target and do all those sorts of things, right? And then he hands that information over to the ops guys, and then the ops guys put it together, construct what it is they have to construct, and then go out and conduct the mission, which almost always is far more difficult and certainly far more dangerous than the intel guy back here, perhaps annotating overhead imagery and picking out what we call DIMPs, desired mean points of impact, where to put the bomb. Okay? That's the physical world. Intel precedes ops. Ops is supportive of Intel. Intel is a supportive of ops. Intel is in a supporting function. The high-end activity is the operation. When you come to cyber. Come back to me with these two corners down here, exploitation and attack. The attack is always a lesser included capability of the exploitation. It is operationally and technologically far more difficult to reside on an enemy network for an extended period of time undetected. Always far more difficult to do that than to, I'm speaking figuratively here, kick in the front door and melt a cathode ray tube. Okay? And so even in our kind of operational construct, this domain puts different parameters on how it is we even think about military operations. We actually have a pretty good body of thought about defense. I mean, I'm talking not about technology and techniques. I'm just talking about what it is we think we want to do. I think we've got a pretty good idea of what it is we want to do down here on exploitation, since it is, frankly, signals intelligence, and we've got a rich history of that. Down here in this corner, for the attack thing, we're still looking for the big ideas. We're still trying to figure out what are the rules down here. I was told that in the new Cyber Command, about 90% of their thinking is going on down here about attack. 90% of what they're actually doing is up here in defense. And if any of you were in some of the small group meetings I was in during my last year or two in government, you would say, I'm really glad they got a lot of energy down here thinking about the attack thing. Because when we actually had to make policy decisions about operations in cyberspace, it was absolutely clear that technology and operational art were infinitely ahead of any policy structures on which we could base them. We were, in fact, when we would give a yes, we knew we were establishing precedent for something about which we had not really digested the ultimate impacts of that precedent being established. I mean, I've been in, take no offense to anyone in the room, but when you're down there at the highest levels of U.S. government trying to explain the elements of computer network attack to people like me and secretaries of this's and secretaries of that, I got to tell you, that technical expert who knows everything about it, who's explaining it in really, truly magnificent form, at about the third sentence, for most of the people in the room, he sounds like Rain Man. I have left rooms in which we have had a consensus, yeah, we're going to go do that. And when we've kind of done the after action, no two people who left that room agreed on what that was that they had agreed to. And look, I'm not blaming this on anybody. It's just that this is very difficult to understand because this fifth domain is just so different from the physical space in which we've kind of gathered up our patterns of thought. Let me give you one. Let me give you one. It's been in the press enough that I'm assuring you I'm only talking about the things I've seen in the press. All right, so we're not going behind any green doors here. Jihadist websites. Okay, I hate them. Okay, you hate them. We can all agree that they're offensive. Now, having arrived at that conclusion, so what? Think of the policy debate that now evolves. We ought to take that site down. Well, unlike in physical space, when a site goes down in cyberspace, how long does it take to pop up somewhere else? And how many of these sites are there anyway? And how fast do they procreate? You know, it's not like putting a bridge in the water, you know, moving across North Africa in 1943 or 1944. Okay? Beyond that, remember, it's not just a video game. When you say, take the site down, you get that visually pleasing effect that it doesn't come up on your screen anymore. But something happened behind the screen. And I guess you should hope that the physical space that was affected is somewhere out there in the broad planet Earth. But there's a reasonable chance, if you're not careful, the physical thing that went pop to make the site went away is in Houston or some other place protected by that thing we call the Fourth Amendment to the United States Constitution. So the lack of boundaries in cyberspace, the ubiquity of cyber access makes this far more complicated than it seems when you say, we got to take that site down, it's showing videos of our soldiers being tortured or something like that. Okay? Finally, if you're looking for an internet attitude of our country, and it's still embryonic, but we're trying to develop it, the internet attitude is the one that Secretary Clinton was very forceful about in a speech she gave about 3 months ago, and it's something called internet freedom. Okay, so now think of this discussion in this small room. We ought to take out this site when your macro policy towards the net is freedom of traffic, freedom of expression. Do you see how this, you know, it's just not as simple as the physical world, and you make it worse when you pull physical world kind of attitudes and physical world patterns of thought into the room when you're trying to think about cyber. We are not the only ones thinking about cyber. The international community, and I know I'm going to leave some time for questions, so let me just end with some, again, embryonic thoughts as to where the international community is with regard to cyberspace. I participated in a Council on Foreign Relations study. A lot of ideas were shared. None of these are finalized, so don't take any of these to the bank, and certainly don't attribute them to CFR. I just mentioned CFR to kind of remind you that you got some really bright folks who are now asking the question, what constitutes international law in cyberspace? What constitutes the laws of armed conflict in cyberspace? And there's an interesting question I should have asked earlier. What set of laws do you vote on to be dominant in cyberspace? Okay? You got some choices here. I'm going to give them to you in a minute. Different aspects of national life have different legal systems on them. All right? So that, for example, the domestic stuff, you know, lying, cheating, stealing, thieving, comes under domestic law. Do you think domestic law should be our model for how the American government governs cyberspace? Or do you think we should use international law, which in this case would be the laws of armed conflict? Should that be the dominant model for governing our actions in cyber? Oh, or should we use espionage law? You know, which is based upon fewer documents, less law, and more accepted international practice. All right? Oh, in any event, back to the story. What are the folks thinking about for the cyber domain? Well, number one, they think it's really chaotic. And they think what we need to do, and they're very chary about going into negotiations and signing treaties. This is not what this is about. But is it possible to have adult conversations among adult nations? How do you define adult nations? Not the UN, okay? But maybe the G20? or maybe the G8, people have something to lose. And you get them in a room, and you begin to think of some broad concepts. Like, for example, outside of actual physical attacks in declared conflicts, denial of service attacks are absolutely forbidden and are never allowed and are never excused. Okay? That kind of bleeds out of Georgia and Kyrgyzstan and Estonia. Okay? And they would certainly admit that if you're bombing a country, you can probably go ahead and try to deny them computer access. All right? But short of that, the thought is that is such an easily available weapon, such a crude device, that we ought to really, what's the right word? Stigmatize its use. That adult nations, people who really play in the international community, they don't do it, and here's the punchline, and they don't allow it to happen from their sovereign space. So that's one thought. There's some thought out there that there are some networks that are so sensitive that maybe we should just kind of hold hands, at least hum kumbaya, and agree that they're just off limits. Okay? One is power grids. Okay? Now, a power grid is, in certainly traditional military thought, a legitimate target of war under certain circumstances. Okay? So now, if you've taken power grid off the cyber batting order, you're saying you can still put Mark 82s and TLAMs on it, but you just can't take it down with a computer, which is kind of madness because Mark 82s are kind of definitive, and that's a one-way switch. That thing is gone. But the cyber attack is reversible. Okay? But their thought process is that the cyber attack just doesn't happen like that. You've got to do what we call IPB, intelligence preparation of the battle space. So you find yourself penetrating, not reflecting any real operations, but if you look at it in the abstract, if you want to have the ability to attack a nation's electric grid in time of war, you can't wait for in time of war to penetrate his electric grid. And so their thought was there's got to be some rules set up because electric grids are so sensitive. You just can't have 23 different services, intelligence services, hacking their way through the electric grid of countries A through N and think that everything's going to end up okay. So anyway, they're thinking, what kind of regime could we establish? The other sensitive network they're thinking about are financial networks. Okay? That the financial network is so fragile that overall finance is so dependent upon investor confidence that cyber penetration of any electrical grid, for whatever transient advantage it might create for the aggressor state, is so harmful to the international financial system that we should just all agree these are like chemical weapons. We're just not going to use them. Okay? Now, none of this is final. All right? And I bring it up only to suggest to you that these are the kinds of thoughts that are churning out there as we kind of come to grips with what does it really mean to conduct cyber war in this new domain? How should we really think about it? And what opportunities do we have now when everything's still malleable to perhaps get some things right for the long term in terms of human competition in this last, or at least next domain? Well, look, I'm afraid that I actually raised more questions than I asked. The mitigation in that is that's probably an accurate reflection of reality. There are a lot more questions out there right now than there are answers. I stand by for the cyber equivalent of Herman Kahn's masterful, monumental On Thermonuclear War, which kind of worked his way through all of the kinds of questions that I've been tossing out here this morning in one volume. But that took place in the late 50s, early 60s, after nuclear weapons had been around for about 15 years. In the meantime, threats and opportunities in this fifth domain abound. we need to have this debate, and I personally await your contributions to this debate that we must have. And with that, thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to your questions. Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thanks, Jeff.
Okay, we're gonna take some questions from the audience until we run out of time. So with that said, let's bring up the house lights a little bit so it's easier to see people's hands. And since we ask a lot of questions on this side of the room, today we'll start taking questions from that side of the room. So anybody over there have a question, raise your hand. And
there's some in here.
Okay. We've got a microphone. Where is it?
Here.
Okay, now we can see. Who's got the question? Okay.
So I think a fundamental question hasn't been answered yet, and maybe I'm just not reading between the lines, but are we in a cyber warfare situation? And if yes, what is going to be, when is the time going to come when public and private truly band together as partners to resolve the situation or help resolve the situation in combat this cyber warfare situation?
Yeah. You can say you're in cyber war, but you have to accept the subset of definitions. So you've got to accept that you believe it constitutes war down here in the espionage exploitation area of kind of the spectrum of conflict. So if you want to say it that way, I would, and then that'd be okay. But again, it's not in our own thinking. We don't think what it is we do when we do C&E to be an act of war. It is that normal espionage thing that's based upon long-standing international practice that routinely happens between and among states, and that's really the legal background for it. Your question generates one other thing I should have mentioned from the CFR group, because their theory was that if you get states to self-limit, if you get states to to limit what it is they do on the internet, state activity there is so pronounced that if states begin to not do some of the things that they are doing, you will lower the noise level on the net, and the truly malevolent activity that is not espionage but is destructive or criminal, the truly malevolent activity will become more visible and easier to prevent. So it's kind of a corollary to what you suggested.
Anybody over on this side of the room? Way back there?
Okay.
We'll send a runner down. Sorry you don't have any lights down there. It's the hangover section.
We made it. You started to talk about how you guys are trying to define sort of like cyber-type rules of engagement in a war. Does this mean that since it's so possible for like a 15-year-old script kiddie to do something in a foreign country that he could set off international conflict possibly because these rules have been defined and he crossed the boundary accidentally, that you'll start to come into taking away the anonymous access that we have on the net as it stands? And that's how you're going to police that, keep people from being able to do this internationally.
Yeah. I'm not quite there in my thinking, but you're reflecting a lot of what I'm thinking about. Right now, in many ways, the biggest obstacle of taking how we usually think about these things and importing it into how we think about it in the cyber world is the aspect of attribution. All right. So if re-engineering could be done to some extent that softens or eases the attribution problem, then much more of traditional thinking could be brought in to thinking about operations, defense, attack, exploitation in cyberspace. I thought you were going another place with your question, so let me just add the additional thought. One of the things that I'm seeing reflected now is that since the price of entry of this is so low and actors act, and they're not state or state-sponsored, or it's very difficult to us to prove they're state-sponsored, one of the thoughts that's kind of rattling around now is to just be uninterested in that distinction and to actually hold states responsible for activity emanating from their sovereign space. and that the rest of the world is indifferent whether the state's doing it or not. The consequences for that action are the same. Okay, and that may be another way to kind of slice away at the implications of anonymity.
All right, let's go to the other side of the room then. Anybody over here with questions?
Here we go.
Okay,
right in the center.
go for it.
Morning, sir. Referencing what you said about power grids and denial of service attacks and the possibility of nations getting together, holding hands, singing Kumbaya, and just saying we aren't going to do that. One, do you believe that that's an actual viable solution, that our enemies would really do that and abide by that? And if not, why is that even an option on the table?
Yeah, and in fact, the American pushback, we have been really late to any international discussions on what's the right word? Arms limitations in cyberspace or control. Fill in the blank, but you get the sense. We're not real anxious to go to Geneva or The Hague and sit down with 80 other nations and begin to huddle up about this. All right. There has been a weakening of that American resolve. I see it in the Council on Foreign Relations. I see it in State Department. They're actually beginning to suggest going to some meetings, not negotiations, going to some meetings. And Keith Alexander, the commander of Cyber Command, in the past 7 to 10 days, actually said that publicly, that we would benefit from some international discussions on these things. Arms limitations, I think, are absolutely off the table because they are totally unverifiable. And don't go there, don't do that. But the broader establishment of international norms among responsible and powerful states and sanctions for the violations of those norms doesn't have quite the effect of treaty. It's not airtight, but it actually may help. Here's an idea that came up in the discussion of the Council on Foreign Relations. I think it had to do with power grids. All right, and it was something along the lines of no American service would penetrate any other nation's power grid absent a presidential finding. All right? And then you make that a declaratory policy. So now the world kind of figures, all right, it's gone to the highest political level. Can't be too numerous. I don't think he does that every day. And then you say, and I invite other nations to do the same. All right? Does that mean all power grids are safe? Oh, no. But it may have a beneficial effect. Frankly, I think that's the limit of the art form right now. That's about as good as we can do. But I think everyone's nervous about getting locked in some sort of arms control discussions for weapons that are essentially undetectable and unverifiable.
All right, we have time for one last quick question, and then we'll move on to switching the rooms and general sessions. So, who will be our right here in the front?
Yes, sir. What's the cyber equivalent of
Wait, so everybody can hear the question?
Yeah.
What's the cyber equivalent of the Incheon Seoul buildup?
When you say Incheon Seoul buildup, you talking about MacArthur landing at Incheon, or
No, I'm talking about
the geography
megalopolis we've got sitting there.
I don't know, and I turn that back to you. But people whose judgment I trust talk about. I've seen Mike McConnell talk about this, and Mike, former DNI. And now with Booz Allen again. Melissa Hathaway in our panel yesterday said words that echoed this. Now these are my words, not theirs. But fundamentally, what they're saying is the long-term answer is the re-architecture. So that, I'm making this up, and I'm thinking only by analogy from the physical world, but choke points and things like that. Don't stop traffic, but do give the defense some opportunities to position itself. And right now, those are so few and far between that the character of the domain is all advantage goes to the attacker. And that's probably unacceptable for all of us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.